We're going to talk to Brant, calling in from Wisconsin. Brant, you are live on Truth Wanted. What's up?
Hello. I'm looking to talk about Thomas Legotti's Conspiracy Against the Human Race. Have you ever heard of that book before?
I have, and I have actually read it. I didn't finish it, but I do have it. It's on my Kindle, and I've read through about half of it. I should have finished it, though. It is a very interesting book. But what about that book did you want to talk about?
Everybody's talking about conspiracies, and I think the conspiracy he brings up is just a conspiracy of existential dread, the lack of meaning, addiction to life, and this desire to perpetuate it, to create our own meanings. And I feel like, as you said, we should be more skeptical about bringing people. We should be more skeptical. Bringing people into the world is a very complex decision, and there's a lot of things that are involved in that are very painful for people and complex and desire upsetting and just full of existential dread. And I feel like people just don't want to talk about the horrors that you could potentially face in life. Skull crushing is one of the things that he mentions in the book.
Yeah. Like I said, I didn't finish. Sorry to interrupt you there, Brant. But yeah, I didn't finish the book, but I thought it was very interesting. Thomas Legotti's sort of philosophy, he talks about these very existential themes, right? And when this title, Conspiracy Against the Human Race, is kind of this idea of saying, look, the real truths about the world are really dark, right? There may be no purpose to life. We may be evolving towards nowhere, and there's nowhere that we're going to go when we die, right? And all that is very hard to swallow for most people. So we kind of come up with these other kinds of ideas and sort of lie to ourselves about life having this meaning and there being grand narratives and these purposes, even though none of that may be true. And he even goes as far as to say, if I recall, that voluntary human extinction might be the most ethical thing we can do, although obviously a very unlikely thing for us to happen, right? And so these ideas are really interesting. I like reading. Yeah, I like reading books on existential philosophy, especially stuff that's as pessimistic as Legotti is. If you are interested in the history of pessimism and philosophy, it all goes back to Schopenhauer, really. But I mean, Nietzsche has talked about this. Lots of folks who have talked about human society and this idea that there are these kinds of fundamental truths that the denial of or acceptance of will completely change the course of human history. And Legotti's whole point, if I recall, is, yeah, it's kind of like a conspiracy. It's kind of like these ideas are just so harmful towards human psychology that it's almost not even worth thinking about. And so what do we do with that? Yeah. And I think that there's some merit to look, maybe there is some things that we can just kind of have, even if they're not true. There is something to that. I'm not going to say that look, every single person on earth has to think the exact same way I do about afterlives and about gods and things like that. I understand that maybe these things aren't literally true, but there might be some value in even contemplating these ideas and maybe even in believing them. That being said, though, the real criticisms I have when we talk about these ideas is the institutions behind them. In other words, the folks that are making huge decisions that affect everybody's lives based on their beliefs, right? I mean, that's why organizations like the ACA exist, is to talk about the separation of religion and government. I'm not here to say, yeah, if your grandmother died at a funeral, you should tell your parents and say well, actually, God's not real. So the fact that you're praying about it is really kind of dumb. That's just kind of cringe, right? You don't want to be that guy. But it's more just okay, there are some truths that I'm going to have to accept if I want to live an honest life for myself and for the folks around me. And they may be hard to swallow, but that's what we're given, right? But anyway, am I doing a fair summary of it, Branch? Because like I said, I didn't finish the book, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, you're doing a fair summary of it. I think a lot of what also kind of gets into it is as you said, with religion, people do have them as kind of a coping mechanism of sorts. You face these existential dreads of the potential that there could be no meaning in life, and you face all this pain and frustration of desires constantly on a daily basis throughout your life. And people have to cope with that in some ways. So it's a natural thing to turn to religion, to turn to spirituality, to turn to and basically anything you can turn to as a coping mechanism, to friends, family, so on and so forth, hobbies. just to basically distract yourselves from the pain. And he kind of gets into how there's like distraction mechanisms that we use, a bunch of different mechanisms that people use to basically cope with things. And I think, as you said, like you mentioned that like your problem was like religion isn't the fact that it's like they're having a wrong knowledge, because wrong knowledge isn't inherently harmful. You could believe grass grows at 2 inches per second, and that's completely wrong. It just doesn't grow that fast, but it's not going to harm anybody to like have that wrong fact. But what you just think is bad is that there's harms that come with the institution, such as like taking away women's reproductive rights and stuff like that, which I 100% agree is harmful.
I think that's a fair summation. Go ahead. Sorry.
I think an imposition that like is also just as harmful and is like the problem that brings about all these harms that like are potential is birth, as Thomas Legotti brings up.
Right.
So like if we didn't have children in the future, there wouldn't be the impositions of future religious tyranny potentials and all these things, all these struggles and existential things that we
I'll be honest, Brant. One of the reasons why I read Thomas Legotti's book is he's one of the only modern writers that I know about that has talked extensively about antinatalism, and longtime listeners of the show know I'm very sympathetic towards an antinatalist view. But that is, neither here nor there. I want to let Zod chime in on this conversation. Zod, I know you haven't probably read this book, but
Yeah, I've been a little quiet because I just simply don't really know what the book's about, and I don't want to speak out of turn. But I think what I'm hearing is that there can be advantage to religion or a positive function to it, just as a way to help us cope with existential dread or with just the big, I don't know, all the problems in the universe can kind of come down on you and feel crushing. And I guess if you try to think of the sum total of your life and how small you are in the universe and all the bad things that are going to happen to you and how short your life is, that can just feel overwhelming. Is that kind of the crux of the problem, roughly speaking?
I think Legotti's book, again, this is from reading it, I don't know how long ago, but less than a year ago, was look, life is suffering, basically. Like there's a lot of reasons to be pessimistic about conscious existence. It may be the case that life is more suffering than it is pleasure, at least for some people, right? And so we have to cope with that. We have to deal with that potential reality. And he mostly talks about that and talks about the ways in which people cope. But in reality, at least according to his worldview, is that we may have nothing to do with this. This is, again, in sort of the vein of pessimistic philosophy, which, again, I talk about Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer also wrote about this, right? He talks about the will, right? He talks about people's will and saying, the will is just going to want things, and you're always going to want things, right? The hedonistic treadmill is always going to be there, and we may never be satisfied. So it's kind of an extension of that idea.
I think I take this as presenting kind of what could be an artificial dichotomy, unless I'm misunderstanding part of the book. But I think an artificial dichotomy could be taken from this between accepting full-on religious factual delusions about the world and our place in it, what happens after we die. And then on the other hand, constantly staring in the face every possible bit of existential dread you could focus on, or constantly thinking about all these big negative questions. If you really sit there and think about the actual facts of life and dwell on that and carry it with you every day, that could feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
But I think there is a place in the middle where you can just focus on the good in life. You can kind of know that's there and pack it away. And that can become a form of subconscious delusion. And I would say it probably is, even for me. I don't sit there and think about all the terrible things that are going to happen and how soon I'm probably going to die and my parents are going to die and all that kind of stuff. That's all true. And I don't try to deny it through some kind of conjecture about the afterlife or spiritual meaning. But I do let myself focus on what today's like, probably take more joy in my current situation than maybe I would if I were thinking about all the morbid details of life. And I think to that extent, I might delude myself a little bit, but I don't delude myself to the fact that it steers my life in a weird direction or allows for weird theological rules or impositions and things like that. So I think
Yeah.
just speaking really roughly, I think there is a middle ground, and there are kind of innocent ways to slightly delude yourself and kind of know you're doing it, which I do on a daily basis, to be honest.
Yeah, one of the things Legotti gets into is that we have to constantly delude ourselves. Otherwise, we're basically going to go mad, or we have to be like extremely sadistic, because just the phones and the computers that we're using to communicate with each other right now have the lithium batteries are mined by slave labor, basically. I mean, like the diets we eat, even if you're a vegan of sorts, like you're going to be getting some extent or another, like animals ground up in the field and stuff like that. Like no matter what, you're contributing to mass amounts of suffering. As Schopenhauer points out, when the lion tears apart the gazelle is experiencing far more suffering than the lion is experiencing pleasure. And it's the same for all experiences of death and consumption. So if you have to constantly tune yourself out to reality, otherwise it's extremely maddening. And people just, it's the nature of reality is like billions of years of evolution programmed into us. So we do have these abilities to tune this out. So we are kind of not really solipsistic, but kind of in a way like stuck in our own minds. We don't like, we have a level of empathy that's kind of developed through like in the human species. But even then it's not like, you can look at like people who are like really empathetic, like truly just like really empathetic, and just they get torn apart. Like a lot of them commit suicide and stuff. And when it comes down to it, like you have to be really, really, really tuned out to reality, I think, in order to like be able to not be depressed, or you have to have a level of like sadism, I think, to some extent or another.
I am of a similar thought process. I've referenced David Benatar's work, Never to Have Been, who talks about this idea. In the beginning of his book, he's like, well, human beings have a psychological bias to basically say that things are fine and things are okay and normal, when really it's not, right? Like we may have a bias to try to find the positivity in ourselves and in the world, when it may just be objectively false, right? It just may not be true. And if you're someone like me who is also sympathetic to this overall idea of a negative utilitarian point of view, which is like suffering, the conscious diminishing of suffering is more important than the active gain of pleasure, then that's going to comport to your worldview. I mean, I am sympathetic to that, but I mean, to Zod's point, if Zod just doesn't think that way, he's just not going to think that way, right? Like if he doesn't, then I don't know, his worldview is just going to be different. This is kind of the problem of moral philosophy, right?
It seems odd though, because to me it seems like experience generates value, like empirical value is generated from like our experiences, like pain does have value, and it is like an extremely visceral negative, and the heights of pain are more visceral than the heights of pleasure, and it seems very demonstrable to like to experience that. Like if you if you could like have like $1 million and push a button, but then a nail would just like shove right through your hand, like tear down your arm, and the doctor would be right there just like repair it up, and you would be completely fine within an hour. Like logically speaking, $1 million and you're going to be completely fine in an hour. But that pain is just so visceral and so like intense and just so opposed to like our biological like programming. That's just like, it's hard to deny that, like, even if you philosophically are like, no, I don't think that pain is like that terrible. I think like it's worth it to endure pain for the goods, or like pain equals gain or whatever. Like I feel like no, it's there's something about pain that's just visceral and true that like just makes so it's like inherently universally valued as like a for subjects. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally get you. Listen, we do have to wrap up this call because we got some other folks that want to talk to us. But in short, Brant, I am very sympathetic to those ideas personally, and I understand that others may not. Zod may have other, counter arguments he wants to bring here. But look, I think in short, there is a lot of suffering in life, and we may delude ourselves to thinking that, like, look, there's some good things in the world, and maybe that makes up for all the bad things. I'm not sure if that's true. And that's just like a really hard pill for most people to swallow. But at least from my point of view, yeah, that might be the case. If we look at the aggregate suffering of not just human beings, but any beings that are conscious enough to experience this subjective feeling of pain, it may outweigh the good. But that fact alone isn't going to stop me from living right now. And I guess I'm going to hang my hat on that so I can, keep on doing what I'm doing. But Brent, I appreciate you calling, and I appreciate you bringing up that book. I'm glad it's a book that I've actually read, or at least partially read, so that I can have something to say about it, because it's a good one. I would say people go check it out if you're interested. Thomas Legotti, Conspiracy Against the Human Race, if you like that sort of thing. But yeah,
I would like to add, I'm not like flatly philosophically against exploring any of these ideas he's talking about.
Sure.
I'm just describing that there is a middle ground where you can cope. I think you have to find a way to engage with these ideas enough to make life real and to function in it, and to kind of be prepared for what's going to happen. Also to be decent enough to the living beings, whether it's animals or people around you. You got to find a way to engage with that enough without it becoming debilitating.
Yeah.
And how you do that is one of the trickier questions in life, I think.